Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. Burnt offerings like the ones we have been talking about this week were not the only kinds of sacrifices that were made in Israel. Sacrifices showing one's praise and thanksgiving to God were offered in many ways and for various life circumstances. There were general daily offerings and special offerings on the Sabbath. There were special sacrifices at Passover and a first fruits offering at the time of harvest. There were sacrifices after a child was born to thank God for the child, and one for an accused adulterous wife. There was the general thank offering as a way of thanking God for a blessing. If you had fulfilled a vow to God, there were sacrifices for that. Or if you had been cured from a certain diseases or unusual body discharges. You also didn't always have to sacrifice an animal. There were grain offerings as well. There were more, but before we get to today's burnt offering, we need to mention the showbread. In the temple there was a special table overlaid with gold, and on that table there were always 12 loaves of bread representing the 12 tribes of Israel. The showbread was always on display and symbolized Israel's continual presence before and with God. The Levites were responsible for baking the bread. It was replaced every Sabbath, and the priests would eat the removed bread. The showbread served as a visual reminder of God's provision and the people's dependence on God. It also symbolized the concept of fellowship and communion with God. There's a significant story about the showbread in the Bible when David and his men were fleeing from Saul and his army and were desperate for some food. The priest gave them the showbread to eat, even though only priests were supposed to eat it. Later on, Jesus uses this story to point out that meeting human need was more important than following the letter of the law. Therefore, it was right for him to heal on the Sabbath. So to remind you, this week we are exploring and learning about the burnt offering sacrifices that were done in the temple in Jerusalem and talking about what they meant. We have looked at burnt offerings, peace offerings, and sin offerings, and today we turn to the last kind, guilt offering. The sin offering that we considered yesterday was offered for unintentional sins that had been committed. The guilt offering was much more specific than that and applied to sins maliciously committed and to certain kinds of sins, particularly those involving dishonesty or violating sacred property. A key aspect of the guilt offering was the requirement for the sinner to make amends for the damage caused by their sin. This often involved repaying the wronged party, and it was stipulated that you repaid the entire loss, plus 20% to cover the priest's wages. Some examples of things you might make this kind of sacrifice for were theft, deceit, violations of sacred property, and oath breaking. You could also make this kind of sacrifice without restitution if you weren't sure if you had committed a sin or what sin you had committed. In other words, you made a sacrifice just in case. Later on, if you find out you did indeed do the sin, you then had to make a sin offering and give restitution. The guilt offering symbolized the need for both forgiveness and restoration for transgressions. And the restitution also highlighted the importance of community. We are all brothers and sisters in God's family. And we are called to live that way and to make things right between us. I'm not sure that this needs to be said, but remorse is also part of the guilt offering. These sacrifices weren't understood as a quid pro quo type of thing. In other words, you couldn't decide to do a sin while thinking that you could simply sacrifice afterward and God would have to forgive you. These sacrifices weren't a license to sin. Rather, sincere remorse was part of it. Recognizing your fault and your failing and coming before God in humility and sorrow was important. After all, God knows the heart. We don't make these kinds of sacrifices today, and actually neither do modern-day Jews. Such sacrifices had to be made in the temple in Jerusalem, and that temple was destroyed almost 2,000 years ago. Nevertheless, our churches have altars to remind us of the sacrifice of Jesus for us. As Abraham said to Isaac, God himself will provide the lamb for the sacrifice. God did. His name was Jesus. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.